Yo, comrades, welcome to this week's episode of Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. Thanks for joining us this week. We have a very exciting episode lined up coming straight into your third eye right now at this moment. Comrade Neil from the From78 podcast, who we just broadcasted our episodes we did on his show, well, now he's here in the library to take us on a journey of the heart, of the mind, of the soul into the realms of science fiction, utopia, and revolution. We're here today to read through Ursula K. Le Guin's science fiction masterpiece, The Dispossessed, from 1974. And we're also going to be bringing in a little bit of Frederick Jameson's essay on Le Guin from his book Archaeologies of the Future, The Desire Called Utopia, and Other Science Fictions. This episode is going to be kicking off a new series we're going to be doing here on Red Library that we're going to call the Lost Futures series, in the spirit of our past episodes with The Regrettable Century, with these ones with Comrade Neil and From78 on various utopian strivings, dialectical reimaginings of the past, and how all this stuff fits together to shine a light on a path forward being here on today's left. This episode is also, I think, a perfect follow-up, a perfect complement to our very popular episode on the conquest of bread that we did with comrades Courtney and Jordan. So if you really like that one, I think this one is going to be just your speed, just your style, just your taste. All right, we're going to dive right into it this week. But remember, please keep supporting Red Library in the various ways that we offer to you. If you're using iTunes and listening to us on that platform, please go down and click on a number of stars, give us a rating, maybe write us a few lines. That's helping us find more and more new comrade listeners, helping to spread the show around, especially on the feeds of some other shows very similar to our own. If you want to throw us a few bucks, get access to some of our exclusive patron-only episodes, head over to Patreon, and for as little as $1 a month, you'll get access to everything that we're going to be offering through there. And we actually are in the process of testing out a Discord, so we're going to try to find some new ways to create conversations, to do some follow-up, and create a bigger community around the show. Like the show on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and so on and so on and so on. Sniff, sniff. All right, y'all, let's do this damn thing. Here's me, Comrade Commissar Don, and Comrade Neil discussing Ursula K. Le Guin's The Dispossessed, and a little bit of Frederick Jameson thrown in for good measure. We'll see you back here afterward.
I figured that there was going to be three of us here talking about this thing. And there's a lot in this book, so much stuff. And when I was rereading it, I was taking all sorts of notes, right? Like I filled up probably almost 3 pages on like a standard legal pad, of stuff that I wanted to get into. And then I was like, hold on a second, there's not going to be enough time to really do this. And I'm kind of going too far into the weeds probably. So what I've done is I've kind of broken things down into 5 things that I think would be interesting to talk about. And I based this kind of off of the outline that you sent me as well. So I'll run through those things, super short version, real quick here. And then what I figure is, you two can tell me which one of these 5 sounds like the most interesting kind of starting point from your perspective. And I'll jump in there because I don't think that these necessarily need to be gotten into in the order that I thought of them.
And maybe just to get us off on the right foot and just to sort of get everyone oriented. So maybe since you're leading this shindig here, Comrade Neil, do you want to go ahead and just give listeners a rundown of what texts you wanted to focus on and what we're here to talk about?
Yeah, today we're going to be talking about a novel, a science fiction novel by Ursula K. Le Guin, and it's called The Dispossessed. And if you haven't read The Dispossessed, it is a kind of sci-fi that I don't think that there's a lot of other stuff like it out there. I've read a lot of sci-fi, and I have not encountered any other science fiction writer that does what Le Guin does the way that she does it. And this novel, out of everything that she's written, is my personal favorite. There's other books that I think she's written that are really, really good, a lot of fun, super interesting, but this one is my favorite. And I think the reason it's my favorite is because of the way that it kind of came into my own life. So I'll briefly describe that.
Yeah.
When I was in college, I grew up a suburban kid for the most part, outside Chicago. Capitalism was the air that I breathed and the water that I swam in, right? There wasn't a whole lot of people talking about revolutionary politics or anything around me, right? I go to college, and that's when things started to change. I took a history class, and one of the first things that I read in this history class was the book by Noam Chomsky, What Uncle Sam Really Wants.
Oh, yeah, I know that one, yeah.
Yeah, and I'd be kind of critical of aspects of that book today and critical of some of the things that Chomsky has said since he wrote that book today. But that was kind of like my gateway into it. And I really liked that book, but not everybody in the class that I was in did, right? There was a lot of other people who I think had a very strong, very negative reaction to it. They thought, why are we reading this? This is, propaganda. This is ridiculous. This is, liberal, left-wing, intellectual, university, whatever. And we don't like it. So I didn't hang out with those people, right? What I ended up doing is gravitating over to the people who really dug the text.
Were those the people that just smoked cigarettes and hung out behind the gym? Because that was my crew.
Absolutely. They definitely smoked cigarettes, and they hung out all sorts of places. They did other things too, right? So these people were really fun. And there was, you get to talking with them about things that you're into. And one of the things that I had been into before going to college was like comic books and science fiction and fantasy and things like that, right? I was really 10th degree black belt nerd kind of kid. That was the background. I remember when I got into middle school, there was the Not Making Out Club, and it was a pretty big club, and I belonged to it. Over time, that club started to lose some really good people, but it didn't for me because of some of the things that I was into. So anyways, I'm into this stuff, and I'm talking to these people about it. And one of the conversations that comes up, is you have Marxists, and Marxists are talking about the stuff that they're talking about. And you have anarchists, and anarchists are talking about the stuff that they're talking about. There was actually an episode of Red Library that reminded me so much of those conversations. I don't remember how old it was, but it was the one you did about Peter Kropotkin's book.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because Don and I were talking about this a little bit as well. You picking this book to me is the absolute perfect follow-up to the Conquest of Bread episode, because it is, some attempt to depict like a real anarcho-communist, anarcho-syndicalist sort of society. So to me, I didn't really plan on that, but after rereading it and thinking about it, I'm like, oh my God, we couldn't have picked a better thing to follow up on that episode with.
For sure, right? So these people were having these conversations. At the time, I did not know who Peter Kropotkin was. I knew who Karl Marx was loosely, but not in any real way. And I'm listening to people debate this stuff, and I'm really fascinated by the differences, the seeming differences between the communists, the Marxists on one side, and the anarchists on the other. Mm-hmm. And what I can remember thinking is that, and there were socialists too, so they were in the mix. They had the socialists, and they seems to be the least radical of the group.
Fuck them.
These communists and these anarchists that both seemed to really want something incredible, but they had seemingly different ideas about how to arrive at this incredible end. And they spent a lot of time and a lot of energy really debating that stuff quite a bit. And I think I ended up going more towards the anarchist side to start with. I think that was largely just because of the people that were in that group at that time. I think that they were more patient with somebody like me, who didn't have, as much knowledge as they did. And maybe in a different group, it would have gone a different way. And the Marxists would have been that way. In this particular group, it was the anarchists that were really interested and I think doing a lot to kind of get new people to hear what they were saying and talk with them about that stuff. So anyways, I started talking with them, and one of them realizes that I'm into science fiction, and they realize that I'm into comic books. And they're like, hey, have you ever read The Dispossessed? And I said, no, I've never read The Dispossessed. They loaned me a copy of it. I actually participated, I didn't know if I ever told you this, Adam, but I'm a part of a project called the Great Book Relocation Project. The way that this project works is people loan me books.
No, you didn't mention this.
I never give them back. And then I loan people
like
books.
That project.
They never give me those books back either. So there's these books that are quote unquote, my books that are somewhere else in the world. I don't know where. And I have books that belong to other people, and they're on my shelf right now, which incidentally seems like the kind of way maybe that people would live if you were living on Anaris in The Dispossessed, right? You could basically kind of do this thing and it would work for you. But anyways.
I have to tell you really quick, I really like that idea because it's a good reframe for me, because there are about 10 people I can think of from my past that if I think of it this way, I don't have just brutal, vitriolic, vengeful spite against them for, never giving me back my copy of Pedagogy of the Oppressed or something like that. So that's helpful for me. I'm getting a little bit of therapy tonight.
I always just assume when I borrow somebody a book that I'm just never going to get it back. So I feel
just assume that?
I feel like I'm giving it to them. If they do give it back, then great. I've just like gotten another book back. But yeah,
you're a true pessimist. That's why I love you.
Do you remember, I think it was in Battlestar Galactica, when Adama gives Rosalind a book and she says something about giving it back to him, and he says, no, you should never loan a book that you want to get back.
Oh, shit, I do remember that line, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I remember when I watched it, I was like, he's on the project too.
Yeah, you're right. Actually, I'm gonna internalize Adama as my new internal object to deal with that in my life.
For sure, right? So I had this book. A lot of things. I got a lot of books in college, and there were books, that I started, and then something needed to get done. I ordered a pizza, and then I never picked the book up again, right? And so it just sort of like traveled with me for a long time. And then eventually, of course, I did read it, and I thought like, oh, I wish I would have read this a long time ago. It would have been great. And that was my introduction to Ursula K. Le Guin. And that was my introduction was the only thing I'd ever read that tried to describe what in true anarcho-communist society might look like, right? There's a lot of complicated theory about this. There's a lot of people in academia, trying to describe this. There's a lot of activists trying to describe this. But this was a story. And it's a really, I think, beautiful story. I think it's a really moving story in a lot of ways for a lot of different reasons. And then when I had you on my show on From78, I don't remember how we got onto the topic, but it's the idea of me coming on this show and talking about something. And this was a thing that occurred to me. I was like, that's a really good book. And I haven't read it in a long time. I'd like to read it again. And so, I brought it up. You seemed to like the idea. I liked the idea. And that's why I think we're talking about it now.
Yeah, and I think we might also bring in a little bit of Frederick Jameson's essay, or maybe a couple of essays on Le Guin from his book, Archaeologies of the Future, The Desire Called Utopia and Other Science Fiction, since we also mentioned that, and I think we're all big admirers of Daddy Jameson, as I call him. So I will say, too, that, I was reading this as well over the last week, or rereading it, and sort of getting refamiliarized with some of the theory and concepts in it. And one of the things that I didn't really know the first time I read it was that, she wrote it in 1974, and it was sort of a response to what she saw in the anti-Vietnam War movement and some of the protests and the sort of activist groups and things that she was actually involved with. And to me, that was actually a really good way to contextualize why she was writing this, not just to sort of engage in critique, but to engage in what peace and hope would look like and to be able to paint a picture of that.
Yeah, I think that's actually kind of a good place for me to jump in with one of the points that I had here, right? And this also comes from the Jameson book as well. It's the point that utopia is not an end. It is a process. And in this book, I think what you see in the story is there are certain characters that see utopia as an end, right? They think it's this thing, we've arrived there. And since we've arrived in utopia, we have to make sure that we stay there and that everybody follows the rules of utopia and that we keep anybody who isn't in it out, because we can't kind of corrupt it by letting sort of anybody else in. That's kind of how I imagine utopia as an end. And unfortunately, I would say that I actually see a lot of utopia as an end thinking within the left today. And I think of this with a lot of different kind of microsects that you might see, believing that there is this end version of utopia and that they know the path how to get there and so on and so forth. And anybody who isn't with them is totally against them, and they shut down discourse. They don't allow for any kind of debate, good, bad, or otherwise. And all that. There's somebody else like Jameson and like Le Guin, who I think see utopia as something different. They see it as a process. They see it as this thing which is constantly happening. It's never done. There's a time for utopia as a process is probably going pretty good, where people are enjoying it. And there's probably time for utopia as a process is not going so good. It's really hard, like in the book when they have to go through that really long famine.
Yeah,
that's part of utopia as a process too. And I think that when you look at it as a process, what it allows you to do is to not engage in, what the psychoanalyst Melanie Klein would call splitting. Seeing utopia as an all good object and seeing anything that isn't utopia as an all bad object. When you look at it as a process, I think that is a depressive way of looking at it, because you got to take the ugly with the pretty and the good with the bad, so on. But that's the only way that I think makes sense.
Yeah, I think that talking about utopia in this book is really interesting, because it seems like a much more, I guess, subdued utopia than I think people would normally conceive of it. And so, and I think that they're even some of the more modern versions of it have the subtitle An Ambiguous Utopia. like the dispossessed and ambiguous utopia. And it is interesting to at least when I read this several years ago, it did bring up a question of what separates a utopia from just another vision of the future, or even like a dystopia, like where are those lines drawn? And, why would this be called utopia and not something else? I don't know, because I think that this is it is a society in which case there definitely is like suffering to some degree, pain. And I think that that's one of the things that makes the book really interesting is that this isn't shied away from or anything like that. It's fully acknowledged.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of other things that really struck me this time reading it, preparing for us to record, were actually a couple of things very much related to this, that Le Guin's depiction of, let's say, some kind of, dare I say, utopian anarcho-communist society is one that almost can only function in conditions of great material scarcity. So Ares, the planet that they live on, is a moon of the larger homeworld Eurus, I think. And on Ares, it's basically this almost completely desolate moon that the reason why this famine is so devastating is precisely because of the conditions of scarcity. So to me, I think two key things jump out. This kind of society, it's almost as if you can't really imagine it being able to function over a long period of time without, let's say, the conditions of, producing things in great amounts and how that would shape markets and, the very material economic practices. You have that, but then you also have the fact that it is still existing within borders, and the figure of the wall, it's such a huge thing in the novel. And there's this really brilliant moment, the way that it starts, about the utopian society is surrounded by a wall. And it's very ambiguous whether that keeps people out or if it also keeps people inside the utopian society as well. And that was something I don't remember getting how nuanced her perspective was on that the first time I read it.
One of the other things that you said, this is a really good kind of parallel to what Kropotkin is talking about. And it makes sense to me because my reading of Kropotkin's work, in particular his book on mutual aid, is that the human species, any species, kind of gets to its pinnacle not through kind of cutthroat competition, that's actually not that helpful. What really helps societies progress to the point where they can, do things like generate a surplus, which they can use when they run low, is cooperation. It is giving mutual aid to one another. And when a species is able to do that, when a group is able to do that, that's going to be the thing that helps that group persist when this utopian process starts hitting turbulence and things get rough, things get hard. You cooperate even more in those times. And that's one of the things about it that I think makes so much sense to me too, right? Like, for there to be a utopia, there has to be suffering of some sort, right? Because when there is suffering, what that can do is that can actually bring people closer together. That can help people create networks of true mutual aid for one another. And it can help them really care for each other and the environment that they're in, the environment that sustains them as well. And I see that in this book. I remember there's a point where Shivik, the main character, gives a toast he has a bunch of friends, they're all gathered, and him and his partner, I think her name is Takber, I don't know if I'm saying that right, just had their first child. And he's saying he's really glad that she was born when times were hard, because being born when times were hard means that she's going to experience a certain kind of life, and that life is going to be hard, but it's going to be good. And what I thought was so interesting in that scene is that at no point does he seem to question whether or not his daughter's going to be able to survive. It seems like he just thinks that she will, that the society that he's in will do truly anything and everything it can to prevent his child from dying. Now, that means that she might not have everything she wants, certainly. It means that it's not going to be comfortable, but she is going to be okay. And that's really interesting to me, right? That's that utopia as a process that I'm kind of trying to talk about here.
Comrade Commissar Don, do you have thoughts?
I don't know if we want to move on to it just yet, but there was, I did want to bring in some of the Jameson.
Do it.
Because I think that the
big other, he arrives. Freddie Jameson.
Yeah, he ends his chapter on Le Guin by basically talking that, at least he doesn't mention the dispossessed specifically, but he does say for Left Hand of Darkness, right, is that it's not like a utopia as such, but the incapacity to conceive of it in the first place. And he seems to be critical of Le Guin for being a little bit too, I guess, liberal when it comes to the approach to like violence or even like a type of quietism. And I was just curious what you two thought, if Le Guin has that same, or if you would agree that there's this inability to conceive of like a utopia, at least as far as like Jameson is concerned. Or like, I don't know, is Jameson just like too much of a tanky or something like that? Like, like I don't know, compared to Le Guin or something. I don't know.
I don't know why the phrase "is Jameson too much of a tanky" is just, I've never had that actually go through my mind. I don't know. I just get a lot of enjoyment out of that phrase. I don't know. I mean, Comrade Neil, what do you think? I'm not really sure.
Okay, so I think that one of the things that I'm noticing about this book is violence is in this book. People do violence. I mean, in the very first opening scenes, I think, Shivik is basically going to try to leave, I say Daenerys, the moon that they're on, which is something that a lot of people don't want him to do. And they've gathered, in an attempt to physically prevent him from doing something. And things get violent. Like, I think rocks get thrown, a guy gets hit in the head,
a guy gets killed.
Injured.
Yeah. Like, I think one of the security members is killed from a rock. Yeah.
Yeah. It hits him in the head.
Yeah.
And so, like, right away there is violence. And then, when he's on Anaris, or not when he's on Oris, there's all sorts of violence, going on there. But what I think is kind of part of the point of the story here is that even if you do create somehow an anarcho-communist society somewhere, say you're able to figure out how to do that and you do it. And this is actually the second point I wanted to make in my reading of this. You're still going to have to deal with castration if you do that. There's no way around that. This is like my Lacanian read coming in here, right? I think that the people who went to Anaris thought perhaps that if they set up a society in a certain way, that it was a fantasy of being non-castrated subject, but they are castrated.
Comrade Neil, so let's say someone's listening to this episode and the idea of symbolic castration and Lacanian analysis is a little new. So how would you define castration in the way that you're talking about it?
Okay, so there's actual castration, right? Which is a physical removal of a part of somebody's anatomy, right? Symbolic castration is different. It's a Lacanian concept. Oh man, you set me up here. This is one of those things that I teach about this often, and it always, like, I say this and students kind of give me this look like, what is this talking about? Like, why is he
You're among friends. You're among friends here. Yeah. We're all castrated. Right, we know that.
So anyways, Lacan had this idea that there's this thing called the phallus. And the phallus, or the way that I try to describe it to students, is imagine a king or a queen and the crown that they wear, right? The crown is a way you could think of the phallus. It's a symbol. It's not, the crown itself is a hat. It's a fancy hat maybe, but it's a hat that somebody wears. And because they wear that hat, they are the sovereign. That means they have the power to do what? To decide things like who lives and who dies, to decide if taxes go up or if taxes go down, the power to start a war or to end a war. All these different things that the sovereign can do that all the other subjects in the realm, they can't do that. I also used the Iron Throne from Game of Thrones recently because that was such a popular show to describe this, right? The Iron Throne is a good way to think of the phallus. So there's this idea.
The fact that phrase was just said on this show is really the highlight of my whole day. So.
Hey, I'm here to please, man. I'm here to help.
You do a great service to the revolution, comrade.
Wonderful. That'll be $32. But so there's this idea that when you're a child that you have the phallus, that you have the power to like control your destiny or something. You see this, like kids will try to do things like open doors that they can't open. I watched like a 4-year-old recently decide that they wanted to try to like move a couch, which was hilarious because there's no way they're going to do that. They're 4, but they don't think I can't do that. They actually, they saw an adult move the couch earlier. And so in their head, they're like, oh, I just saw that adult person move the couch. So clearly it can be done. I'm going to go do it. And they can't. And that's the thing. When the child realizes that they can't do a lot of the things that they think they can do, the things that they want to do, that means that they don't have the phallus, that they're castrated. This tends to lead to a fantasy that if I don't have the phallus, that's not cool, but somebody else, my parent, must, right? My parent actually has the power to do things like make things happen and keep me safe. My parent is like a sort of demigod figure that can do all sorts of things. Like the way that a kid probably experiences their mom or their dad using like a credit card to buy something, they don't experience that as the way that adult experiences that. They just think that their parents have this magical thing that they can use to get whatever they want because their parent in their minds is a non-castrated subject. Time goes on, kids realize that their parents are castrated, so on and so forth. But anyways, another thing that Lacan kind of talked about this, and he talked about the phallus is a lost object. When we were young, we thought we had this thing, we thought we had this power, and then it became apparent to us that we did not. We lost that object, and then we spend a ton of time in our lives in all sorts of unconscious ways trying to recover this lost object. I would say that in this book, in The Dispossessed, what people did when they created Anaris could be viewed as an attempt to recapture the lost object, right? To create a society within which you could say that there would be non-castrated subjects would be one way to look at it. The other way, and this is opening up a totally different Lacanian box, is you can say that they would just all assume the female subjective position, the female sexuation, and just live that way as well. And I can get into that if you want, or I can get into that later.
Maybe what we could touch on is this way that the creation of, I was saying Aris earlier, wasn't I? But it's Anaris?
Anaris. Yeah.
Okay, so the creation of Anaris was built upon this desire to be non-castrated subjects, because the situation in which they were escaping on Eurus was one of a hyper free market capitalist society, which they experienced an intense amount of symbolic castration, let's say. I think one of the most interesting things about Le Guin's depiction of Anaris is how even in what seems as if it's this, way to exist in society with others that is not castrated, they're still dependent on trade with Eurus in this weird, semi-secretive way. And to me, that was a really, really powerful thing in the story, is setting up this way that even if you were to create a society like this, it still is going to potentially be dependent on these other societies that it's wanting to escape from these societies, but it still is existing in a state of dependence on them in a very material way. And I think that plays out very interesting in terms of how Shevik eventually goes back to Eurus and tries to share, what was his theory called? Do you remember?
Simultaneity.
Yeah. Right. So whenever he goes back and they want him to go and he's been in contact with them, but the way that it's sort of like the idea of a non-castrated subject interacting with who they think is a castrated subject, to me was really fascinating. The way that the society still had to exist in a very kind of real material relationship, even though the society exists on this, illusion that it is truly independent of the thing that it was escaping from.
Just so I'm clear, Neil, is your interpretation that the citizens on Anaris are actually not castrated, or you would say that they still remain to be castrated?
I would say they're absolutely castrated.
Yeah, okay,
yes.
okay, yeah. Okay,
for sure. The wall that Adam brought up in the beginning is a symbol of the castration, I think.
Gotcha. And so just because you guys are the Lacanians and I'm definitely not, I'm not very familiar with this stuff, would there be a way of talking about, is castration essentially a yes or a no, or is there less or more, would we be able to talk about the citizens of the moon as being because they do seem to have at least somewhat more power over their own lives as being less castrated to some degree? Or is it basically just you're either you are or you aren't?
Everybody is.
Okay, right, yeah.
So there's a couple of breakdowns you can look at this from. One is the breakdown between a neurotic and a psychotic. The Lacanian school that I'm a part of anyways, right? There's different people who have different readings on Lacan. So I'll give you mine, even though other people would probably have different readings. There's really only 4 categories that people will fit into, possibly 5. You'll have 2 big categories, psychotic on one side, neurotic on the other, and you have 2 subcategories within each of those. And then the potential 5th category is the perverse. So I'll start with the psychotic. Psychotics are people who do not acknowledge, see, or experience symbolic castration. They are people who will go and they will do things that you, quote unquote, cannot do, but they will not actually think that they're doing anything wrong. So for example, a psychotic is driving around in, Austin or Chicago or something like that. They're going somewhere and they can't find street parking. So they're looking, and then they see there's a driveway and there's no cars in that driveway. They'll just go ahead and park in the driveway. It's not their driveway. They don't care, right? And then, later on, if somebody comes out and there's dude, what are you doing in my driveway? The psychotic reaction is there's a spot here. What are you talking about? I just parked and you weren't using it. So I decided I was going to use it. They don't think there's anything weird in this. They think that they can just do what they want because they don't experience the castration. That doesn't mean that they're not castrated, right? Because if people behave in a psychotic way for a long enough time or in an intense enough way, what usually ends up happening is they get removed from society, right? The castration is kind of foisted upon them in that way. So there's 2 types of psychotics. There's ordinary psychotics and there's extraordinary psychotics. An ordinary psychotic is a psychotic who has a psychotic belief, a psychotic delusion, but this delusion is not such that they need to be taken out of society. So to give you an example of this, I would say that there's a lot of people who are extremely religious, and the way that they have thought about their religion, because I am this particular religion and because I do whatever I do as a part of that religion, that means that I'm not castrated. And they will kind of go that way. And people will tolerate this belief because religion kind of passes effectively. Now, if somebody were to say that, not all religions, some religions pass that. If somebody were to, talk about worshiping Thor, in the way that people talk about believing in Jesus, I think they might actually be removed from society, but I guess I can't prove that.
Are you talking about Marvel movie Thor or the actual God?
I don't think
does it really matter?
Actually. Yeah.
mean, at least the Marvel movie, well, at least the actor actually exists, right? So,
well, that's true.
If you were to worship him, would it be
so
more
here's a
acceptable?
different way to think about it. If somebody was an extraordinary psychotic, they might actually act out their psychosis in a way that makes it so that other people cannot tolerate it. So if somebody was just like, I worship Thor, and they were trying to, like, I don't know, stalk the Hemsworths, you know, and break into their house, like that wouldn't work. That would be an extraordinary psychosis. They'd take it too far.
And I'm very protective of the humans because they're so helpless and ridiculous.
You know, I have to tell you, I would pay an infinitely greater amount of money to see a film about someone stalking the Hemsworths, thinking that he actually was Thor, than any Marvel movie that will ever be made. I'm just throwing that out there.
I like Marvel movies. I'm going to go on record. I totally am a superhero fanboy.
No, podcast over. Sorry, Neil. No, I just spent a very short mini vacation, just completely in a weird, perverse way, just enjoying a Marvel movie marathon. So, I mean, I can't hate.
Best one?
You mean of all the ones I watched, or just all the Marvel movies? I mean, it was 2. So, I don't know.
Wait, two movies was a marathon? Wait, two movies?
No, I'm just saying I watched 2 of the marathon. But Civil War. Captain America Civil War. That was the best one of the bunch.
Fair.
Yeah, so this is interesting because, like, superhero fiction, I think, is a great example of people having other fantasies of non-castration, right? It was a bunch of nerds who were experiencing symbolic castration in a pretty intense way, and they came up with these fantasies, right? These fantasy ways of being like, this is what it would be like if were I not a castrated subject. I would be like this. And it's really funny because, like, sometimes I'll ask people, like, you know, would you rather be able to fly or be invisible or something like that, just to see what they say? And, you know, people answer everything answer. And then I'll ask them, you know, what's the first thing you do after you figured out how your power worked? And nobody ever says, I'd go and fight crime. It never
So I'm curious. I mean, since we're on this little digression, but I think it's really important. Would we consider things like Watchmen, or I don't know if y'all have watched The Boys or read the graphic novels of The Boys, if those sorts of depictions of superheroes are almost this really strong critique of trying to show how superheroes themselves are still castrated, like they're still very horrible, flawed human beings at their core?
Yes.
Okay, fair enough. All right, good.
I really want a Lacanian reading of One Punch Man.
We should do a premium episode on One Punch Man.
That'd be interesting. Have you seen that, Neil?
I have not.
Oh, it's an anime.
Yeah, it's on Netflix. It's easily one of the best animes that I've seen in a very long time. Very smart, completely hilarious. One of the funniest shows I've seen in quite some time as well.
You know, I've seen, like, trailers for it and all that, and that's actually really kind of funny too, because one of the things that kind of bring this back to the castration thing that comes up here is that people think that being non-castrated would be awesome. They think that would be the best. The weird thing is, part of what happens when you go through a Lacanian analysis is you realize that it would suck to be a non-castrated subject. It would be terrible. It would be awful. You would be so completely and totally bored all the time. There's an old episode of the Twilight Zone that does this, and I think it's called A Nice Place to Visit, but I'm not sure about that. Here's the basic rundown of the plot. Dude's robbing places. His name is Frankie Valentine. He's got a great name. So Frankie Valentine's robbing places. You know, one time a robbery goes wrong and he gets shot. And then they run the opening Twilight Zone thing. And, you know, he wakes up and he's in this room and there's this old dude in a white suit there. And Frankie Valentine, like, sees the guy in the white suit and he reaches for his, like, knife or his gun or whatever. And he's like, hey, give me all your money, to the guy in the white suit. And the guy in the white suit's like, dude, I am happy to give you all of my money. While I'm at it, here's the keys to my Rolls Royce. It's parked right outside. And if you'd like, I can take you to my house, which is your house. And it's filled with pretty much any food you'd ever want to eat, art, all the things you'd want. That it's right there. And it's yours. And so Frankie's going like, I died and went to heaven. This is great. So he goes to the house and he eats the food and it tastes good. And then he says to the old guy, he's like, where's the casino? And then he's like, oh, it's just right across the street. Look at that. So he walks across the street. He plays blackjack. He gets 21. And he plays again. He gets 21. He plays a third time. He gets 21. Like the fourth time, he's got 20. And he says, hit me. And he gets 21, right? So then he takes all his money and he plays roulette. He puts everything he won on like 13 black or something like that, right? And they roll the wheel and guess what comes up? 13 black. So this goes on for a while. And eventually, like, he ends up like kind of calling up the old guy who was there in the beginning, whose name was Pip. And he's like, Pip, this is ridiculous. You know, what kind of heaven is this? I can't lose no matter what. It takes all of the joy out of winning. And Pip goes, oh, you thought this was heaven? dude, you got it all wrong. You're in hell. And that's a great way to understand what it might be like were you actually a non-castrated subject.
What I think is so interesting about that too, and since we're talking about science fiction and utopia and all this stuff in general, I was actually just reminded of a film I would definitely classify as sci-fi. And full disclosure, it is a horrible film, but it's called Zardoz.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
With Sean Connery. Because I think what's so interesting about that film, as terrible as it is, well, number one, there's a really great line, which I'm going to paste in here, about the gun is the penis.
Zardoz speaks to you, his chosen ones. You have been raised up from brutality to kill the brutals who multiply and are legion. To this end, Zardoz, your god, gave you the gift of the gun. The gun is good. The gun is good! The penis is evil. The penis shoots seeds and makes new life to poison the earth with a plague of men, as once it was. But the gun shoots death and purifies the earth of the filth of brutals. Go forth and kill.
Have you ever seen Zardoz, Neil?
I think I have.
I mean, it's one of those things where it just sort of like goes right through you whenever you watch it. You know,
Sean Connery in a red diaper.
In the red diaper. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But
one, like, we need guns, really big guns. Is that one of the lines in that movie?
I don't know. I can't remember.
Yeah. I don't think
it's
so.
something different then.
Well, if you haven't seen Zardoz, I really think you would probably greatly appreciate doing a very hardcore Lacanian reading of it, because there are these immortals in the film. And the immortals, I was about to say, they can never die. I'm like, well, that's the meaning of immortal. But anyway, but the whole point is that the immortals are depicted as being these just like incredibly in deep existential despair characters, because they've so thoroughly been able to achieve and experience everything that's possible to experience. And they just exist in this sort of catatonic boredom for the rest of eternity. And, you know, as shitty as a movie as that is, I think it actually kind of depicts like, oh yeah, if you weren't this castrated subject and you really did have this sort of illusory like wholeness, yeah, it would just basically be a horrible, just sort of nihilistic experience like every moment of your life.
I agree with you that it's a terrible movie, but it's like interesting.
It's a good bad movie.
And it's like, yeah, it's worth watching because it's terrible, but at least keeps your attention.
And this is what I think is that utopia is a process thing. When Shivik gives that toast and he's like, I'm glad that my daughter was born in hard times, right? He gets it, I think. I don't think he's quite consciously grasped it, but he understands the value of castration. He understands that you know, people on Anaris who are like, no, we've got it all figured out. We don't need to think about this critically in any way because we nailed it. He's like, they don't get it. And that's his beef, I think, with his own society in a large way, right? Is that they're behaving as though they were, well, not all of them, but many of them, the majority of them are behaving as though they are non-castrated subjects, that they've got utopia as an end. And as a result, they don't try to do certain things. They just want to kind of keep things the way that they are, because they think if things change too much, then they might become castrated. And I think his message is, we are castrated. And so are the people on Oris. They're castrated too, and we're just castrated in different ways, which, Don, was your original question, I think, when I started talking about psychotics and neurotics. No, anyways, to bounce back to that, neurotics actually just, they accept castration, they get that they're castrated, and they just try to find creative ways to kind of like get over and around castration. And the two kinds of neurotics are hysterics and obsessives. Gotcha. But anyways, so Shivik recognizes this, and when he goes to the planet, when he goes to Oris, one of the things that he realizes is, and this is another Lacanian idea, I think this is in Seminar 20, in case anybody cares. Lacan has this idea where he talks about two different reactions to castration. One is the male subjective reaction, and the other is the female subjective reaction. Now, it doesn't mean that like men react one way and women react a different way. So there could be a person who's like biologically male who has a female subjective reaction and vice versa. So the male reaction to castration is usually like, I'm castrated. This makes me into an insecure man-child. And because I'm insecure, the way I'm going to deal with that insecurity is I'm going to find somebody else who's weaker than me, who's more castrated than me, who has less than I do. And I'm going to really do what I can to castrate them more. I want to, and in fact, I, as a castrated subject, seek to find somebody else who I can make more castrated than myself. That's the typically male reaction. The female reaction is to go, okay, I'm castrated. This isn't fun. when I look around, Adam, you're castrated, and Don, you're castrated. And if we really think about it, everybody else who we know is also castrated. So we're all castrated, which means that, yes, this sucks, but I'm not going through this thing that sucks alone. I'm going through it with other people. We're in this, in a sense, together. And then we can use that to kind of create different ways to support each other as we experience this symbolic castration. And that can be really interesting and worthwhile to do it that way. So the way that I read The Dispossessed is that Oris, the planet, where capitalism is in full swing and doing awesome, they are adopting the male subjective position in relation to castration. And on Anaris, they have largely adopted the female subjective position to castration.
And maybe on another sort of comparative note between the two societies, this might actually come back to the role of violence in the sort of I almost said anarcho-capitalist society.
This isn't a Heinlein novel.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, you're right. Heinlein's for another episode. But I was really taken with the way that Shevik sort of throughout the novel, and an interesting sort of structural thing about the novel too for anyone who hasn't read it, is that only the first and the last chapters sort of depict events in the same time and in the same society in the same chapter. So throughout the middle of the book, they sort of alternate between one chapter is on Anaris, usually earlier in time before Shevik goes to Eurus to try to share his sort of theoretical discoveries with them. And then the other chapter will basically be what is happening on Eurus as he goes through this process, which I found really interesting just as a way to structure the novel. But one of the things that really hit me this time was how as he's growing up and learning and sort of existing in the society on Anaris, this I almost said it again, this anarcho-communist society.
That is a really interesting slip, dude.
I know. Well, maybe it's because on some level I have just as harsh critiques against anarcho-communists as I do against anarcho-capitalists. They're just different. But that's for another show, I guess. But I guess the interesting thing to me is how power and violence still exist and power functions in a different way on Anaris. It's just not, it functions more through the role of norms, which is a strangely Foucauldian point to bring up. That, on Anaris, it's like power is still there. It just exists in this almost sort of common sense, public opinion sort of role of norms and keeping society in this very almost sort of cohesive way of trying to keep this sort of, let's say female version of how to respond to castration. It's that also comes with power. It's just that you don't see it as visibly on the surface until later in the novel.
For sure. I think that there's one of the chapters, I can't remember which number it is, but what happens in the chapter is Shevik is on Oris in this, right? And he actually has met somebody, this girl, I think you'd say her name is Vera or Vara, maybe.
I was really hoping we were going to talk about this.
And so anyways, he meets this girl, and at first it's they really hit it off. They have a friendship with some sexual tension stuff going on in it. And at one point they go to a museum, and in the museum is this cloak that was worn by an old ruler of the country, Queen Tiaea is how I'm going to say her name. And it's a cloak which is made of scraps of human flesh that have been sewn together because she was such a tyrant, right? She basically, she was this ruler who came in and through a total massive brutal force was just able to make everybody in the society kind of do what she wanted them to, and to force them into some kind of social organization, some sort of economic organization, etc. And what Shevik has this interesting conversation where the Vara says to him, you have your own Queen Tiaea on Anaris. She's just in your head. And Shevik says, yeah, in my head is where she belongs. And Vera says, you're wrong, man. If she's in your head, you can never, ever actually do anything to overthrow her. You can't actually rebel against her in any meaningful way because she's you. She's in your head. When she's out in the world, at least you can take her out in some way, shape, or form. It might be really hard, but you could do that. When I was reading that, I was thinking of Foucault the whole way through that chapter, right? Here it is. Here's Foucault's point, I think, about, the way that the panopticon functions as this totally decentralized system, network of power. So even if you take out one node, it doesn't matter because there's, however many millions of other nodes that are going to just pick up the load. Well, that one gets repaired.
Well, maybe on that note, I think over the last couple of points you've been raising with the book, Neil, I was sort of curious, thinking about this in the way that Le Guin depicts Utopia, and is there a way, if we kind of take this Lacanian way to read the novel, can it help us in some way understand, let's say, whenever we're encountering or having some sort of dialogue with people who tend to align with various strains of leftist politics and philosophy, is there some way that looking at the dispossessed this way can help us understand, like, why is it that some of us tend to like gravitate towards certain political philosophies in a certain way? And not saying that we can, in a really cheap way, like psychoanalyze people and understand like why they think one thing or another. But to me, I guess reading this book again this time, actually, it helped me understand some of the sort of gaps or like blind spots in, political positions that I've definitely held myself at different times, and wondering like, what was it that I was missing? And I think a lot of it was the way that Utopia does sort of function as this ideal escape out of the experience of castration, which again is very much conditioned and structured by the social and economic relations of capital right now. So, I mean, to me, I think that's why I find Jameson such a powerful corrective, is to say, listen, we're not looking for some uncastrated existence or non-castrated existence. What we're looking for is, maybe a different experience of castration. And that's why his idea of utopia is not to give us some like perfect future end state, like a thing. The process of it is using utopia to help us reframe our experience of the present and the conditions of the present. So I don't know. I mean, there's probably a lot there, but I was curious what both of y'all think of that.
So there's a lot there. So let me.
That's why I said there's a lot there, Don.
Yeah. I guess when I think of this book as like a whole, and maybe my reading of this is completely different from both of yours, so you guys can ruthlessly critique this if you want. But I read this book in a similar way to like maybe some Dostoevsky, in the sense that like Le Guin is, in a sense, writing a book and playing devil's advocate, or like deconstructing her own idea of like what this utopia is, or and so when I read something like Jameson, who seems like pretty critical of like of what her vision of utopia is, or how far she's like willing to go, I just like wonder if it's like maybe fair to think that an author should just be presenting like a purely like an ideological perspective on utopia, instead of it being like as much of a personal exercise for the author to kind of explore their own utopia. I don't know if that actually answers your question at all, but
I think that one of the things that I notice with people on the left and on the right, and this happens on both sides of the political spectrum, is that people will take some sort of ideology and they will turn that ideology into the thing that they use to defend themselves from castration anxiety, ultimately. Right. So this is everybody, I believe anyways, I guess I shouldn't say this as if it's true, just as a fact or something like that. I would say that everybody is worried about castration. We're anxious about castration. When our castration asserts itself in some way, shape, or form, when there's some sort of experience that forces anybody to recognize that, they are a limited person with limited capacities in a world that is perhaps largely indifferent to them, that tends to make people get really freaked out. They have what people might call an existential crisis. That is castration anxiety. It is the anxiety that we experience when we unconsciously or consciously run up against the wall of castration. That's what it does to us. So I think what people will do is they will use some kind of a political ideology to construct a fantasy of, if I were to take this ideology and kind of like carry it through to fruition, then I wouldn't need to be worried about castration anymore. It would be something that would just not be an issue in my life because I would have taken this through to its conclusion. Now, that's actually, I think, a really useful and interesting psychological defense mechanism, because in most cases it actually works, because it gives people a symptom, right? This is where you start to see ideology as a symptom. People become, anarchists, communists, libertarians, Proud Boys, I don't know, whatever the thing is. And that's their symptom. And the symptom is how they're dealing with the anxiety that they experience when they get closer and closer and closer to the wall of castration.
Comrade Neil, can I ask you a question about this?
Yeah.
So based on this, would you say that whenever I'm doing my Stalin cosplay on the weekends, am I in fact dealing with my symptom? Is that what's going on?
I would say yes.
Okay, fair enough. I never thought of it that way.
But I'm going to throw a curve at you here, I think, right?
Do it.
So here's another thing too. Like I don't think this ever came up in any of our conversations in the past, Adam, but I go and talk to a psychoanalyst myself. Like I'm going through psychoanalysis and have been going through it for a while. And so part of what I'm talking about comes out of my own experience of analysis, just to say that. Mm-hmm. When you go into analysis, when I went into analysis with a symptom. And my symptom really was that I was depressed because, the world was in the position that it's in. Social justice is this thing that never actually, people talk about it, but nobody actually wants to do it. This makes me sad. We're living through like climate crisis. That's scary. I mean, there's all sorts of things to be totally sad about, right? So I go in and I'm sad. I'm also scared. I'm scared of all sorts of things too. And this is one of the reasons why I went in. I went into psychoanalysis originally because I wanted to become a psychoanalyst, right? So like in order to become a psychoanalyst, you have to go through psychoanalysis. And so I'm thinking like, okay, I got to do this in order to get this thing that I want. And when I get this thing that I want, then I won't be castrated, right? That was sort of what I was doing. Again, that works, right? It's a stabilizing thing. Symptoms are not problems. They're solutions to problems. This is the second time I'm actually ripping somebody off. I should give him some credit. That's a Peter Rollins line. And the thing about the Twilight Zone that I mentioned earlier, that came from Peter Rollins too. So if anybody ever wants to check out something cool, like Google Peter Rollins and pyrotheology, it's great stuff. But anyways, so you go in, you have this symptom, you're trying to figure it out. And then as you go through this analysis, what I start to recognize is, wait a minute, if I actually achieved these ends, what would I do then? Like, what would actually happen for real? And I remember even at one point in my analysis thinking that if I lived in some kind of like bizarro universe where, say like the communism had actually triumphed over capitalism, I'm willing to bet that just based off it, and I was still the me that I am in this universe, I would probably be somebody who was talking about like the virtues of capitalism, because capitalism would have been the thing that lost. And that's not necessarily a pleasant thing to realize about oneself if you're me, but I mean, that came up through the analysis, right? It's that what I really desire ultimately is not to win, but to struggle against something. That's what makes my life interesting. That's what makes it cool. That's what makes it bad, but also good, ultimately, right? That's the jouissance in it.
Yeah, I mean, as our friendly neighborhood Maoist would say, dare to struggle, dare to win, comrades.
Word, totally.
Yeah.
There you have it.
I mean, what's really interesting about this too is I think this is why Zizek will often give his analysis of V for Vendetta, and his joke about the end is how he'd sell his mother into slavery to get V for Vendetta 2, where it's the day after the revolution.
The end of the film. My joke is always that I'm ready to sell my mother into slavery for a film called V for Vendetta Part 2. But what happened the next day? How will they effectively reorganize lives? I think this is the great failure of the left today. Even when capitalism obviously is more and more in some kind of a crisis. I mean, I remember all the time when I was young, when welfare state capitalism, at least in Western Europe and United States, was functioning relatively well, the left was saying, wait a minute, there will be crisis. We just should, like Lenin in Switzerland, or wait and prepare. Okay, then there was a crisis, and what happened? Nothing. The left was not able to offer not even a minimal serious proposal.
And I think what's so interesting is that the depiction of revolution, which also I think overlaps a lot with depictions of utopian societies in sci-fi, is always this thing of where it's very, very difficult to imagine the day after the revolution, because it's almost as if it would require the sort of psychoanalytic insight that the exact desire for utopia is in itself, but like we don't think of it that way. We're just sort of stuck in this mode of where we keep postulating like, this is what the utopia will be, this is what it is, this is what I want it to look like, this is the day the revolution comes. And if we find ourselves having a challenge thinking about what happens after that, will I actually be a non-castrated subject? Will I be satiated? Will my desire actually be, quenched for the first time? We find ourselves hitting a wall with that, because I think in some level it's the way that our subjectivity sort of orients itself around some of these same sorts of insights. And this is why we talk about psychoanalysis and stuff so much on the show, because guess what? It's fucking relevant for thinking about revolutionary politics quite a bit, listeners, comrade listeners. We love you.
There's Lacan has a riff on this that I think is instructive. This is my read on his riff anyways. This is the late Lacan. Like Lacan kind of has these 3 periods. Some people say 2, I say 3. So everything from like 1972 on is what I'm thinking of as the late period. And he did a seminar on this, what he calls the syntome, which is SINTHOME, which sounds like symptom, but it's a certain kind of symptom. He uses James Joyce as the example. So here's the deal, right? James Joyce was a dude who wrote in a way that nobody else wrote. He effectively broke all of the rules, right? Like if there was a rule about how you were supposed to write, James Joyce specifically didn't follow the rule. But he wasn't doing it in a psychotic way where it's like he was unaware of the rule and just sort of like doing things without any kind of like understanding of what he was doing. He actually understood the rule. And because he understood it to the extent that he did, that's what actually allowed him to break the rules in the way that he did and to kind of like sort of jujitsu the castration, I think, in a really interesting way to sort of use it. I think that's what Shivik is doing in this book too. I think what he's trying to do is pull a Joyce, right? He understands when he has the conversation he has with the ambassador from Earth at the end. He's talking about what Anaris has to offer. It seems clear to me that he understands the rules of the game in a way that most people actually don't. And because he understands the rules of the game, he, throughout the narrative, I think is able to kind of break the rules of the game and actually have that work out in a way that it wouldn't work out for somebody who misunderstood the rules or just didn't understand the rules or didn't know about the rules.
I'm kind of wondering on this point too, since we're referencing the end of the novel. I mean, the end of the novel is that, Shevik basically goes back to Anaris, and there's at least, kind of the utopian hope that what they're going to do is actually recreate a relationship between Eurus and Anaris in a new way. And I actually was finding this a really interesting, almost like dialectical sort of depiction of what the real utopian vision in this novel isn't necessarily that Anaris exists. Because there's that great line, I can't remember exactly what it is, but Shevik says something along the lines of, they took one step, but Shevik himself was taking 2 steps. He was taking another step even beyond where they were at, because he was precisely trying to get out of this deadlock that being on Anaris in this anarcho-communist utopian society was in itself an experience of non-castration. He was trying to move beyond that and say, actually, we're going to put ourselves back in dialectical sort of relationship to Eurus in this new way. And he was this sort of figure of that sort of yearning to do that. And I mean, again, it's kind of an interesting thing. And it's a pretty challenging idea too. And maybe, I don't know if Jameson would chalk this up to sort of the liberal strain of Le Guin showing through of how to say, actually, even if you were to create this anarcho-communist society, even that would have its limitations. And so maybe then what you'd have to do is relate yourself to capitalism in a new way.
I mean, there seems to be that theme throughout all the book that the journey is not just going out, but it's returning, right?
Yeah,
and I think that...
What is that line? It's like the real return is going home.
Journey is always return.
Journey is always return.
Yeah, and so it's interesting that, I mean, it's not only for about halfway or more than halfway through. It's basically him returning to Eurus, but then I think at the end of the book, it's also like Anaris as like a civilization returning back to, or like there's like this reconnection between them that seems to be go into what Neil was talking about of Utopia as like a process, that it's not just like separating and creating something new, but it's also returning back and trying to reconcile or something like that with the old.
That was one of the other points that I wanted to make here too, is that it's the dialectic that, as I see it, kind of playing out in this, right? And this is sort of embedded in that idea of utopia as process. It's a dialectical process. So in this novel, one of the things that happens, right? There's a rule which is that nobody from Oris can ever come to Anaris, right? Like there was a certain number of settlers and they came, and then the port was closed. And anybody who's on Anaris, what they can do is they can pretty much do anything they want to do as long as it's of their own free will, right? Like there's effectively no power who's going to tell you you can't do that. That's just not how they work, right? So if you don't want to do your job, you don't do it. If you want to pick up and move to a totally different place, you move there, and there will be a place where you can stay. And you only have to kind of scrape and scrounge to get some cash so that you'll be able to stay in some shady hostel or something like that. There'll be a place for you. Ultimately, and everything. It's just that you have to do things of your own initiative. That's their rule. So Shivik basically does a dialectic on that. He uses his own initiative to do the thing of returning to Oris, right? He's like, one of us they can't come here, but I can go there, and I do it of my own initiative. And it was funny because when he did that, it was like kind of daring the people who were talking about what Anaris was, right? That it was this utopian hope where people could do what they want, where people could kind of have their own personal initiative be the thing that drives what they do and how they live. And he was like, so I'll use my initiative in this way. And it's great because when he does that, he's performing a total dialectical reversal, right? He's going, and he's not like, here's the problem, here's the solution, now let's synthesize these together. But the dialectic and the way that like Zizek talks about it, right? Which is by going as deeply as you can into something, you discover the contradiction in that very thing. And I think that's what he does with initiative, right? He by saying, I'm going to use my own initiative to do a thing, he exposes the contradiction of one's own initiative to never be one's own initiative, that one's own initiative does not exist in the way that these people think that it exists. It always exists in relation to the initiative of others and the way that others react to that initiative, either in a way which is encouraging or restraining or something like that, right?
Yeah, I mean, it almost seems on that point too, that comes back to the real sort of function of power, the form that power takes on Analyst is in the form of, again, these Foucauldian norms. And it's almost as if, like his pushing of the contradiction of freedom and initiative eventually, shows the contradiction inherent in the fact that, well, these norms are still this form of power that is governing our society in a particular way. And I can do everything but, this sort of unstated thing that exists as this sort of like seedy underside to Analyst that keeps it functioning in the way that it does.
Yeah, that was the thing, right? Like the Analyst had the big other the same way that there was a big other on Orus. The big other just castrated maybe in different ways or created different subjective reactions to that castration. Mm-hmm. But the big other, like when people left Orus and they went to Analyst, they didn't escape the big other. They brought the big other with them.
Don, you have thoughts? Who's your big other?
Good. Yeah. Well, Neil, I know you said you had like 5 things you wanted to. How many of them have we touched on? Were there?
I think we talked about 4 of the 5 so far, right? Which was like the dialectic and the castration and Utopia as a process. Oh, yeah, that's 3. So there's 2 more. There's 2 left.
Okay.
So one of them is another kind of like riff from a Lacanian lens here. And this is something that came up in an earlier, I think, 2 episodes of Red Library that you did with Alex about the Badu book, Philosophy for Militants.
Oh, yeah. Uh-huh.
I can't remember which episode it was, the first or the second, but at a certain point, you and he talked about the discourses, the 4 discourses. Those are something that I saw a lot in this book, too. What I think, so as a refresher, there's the discourse of the master, the discourse of the university, the discourse of the hysteric, and the discourse of the analyst. And I think you can see all of these discourses playing out in different chapters in this book. So the discourse of the master is very present, I think, in most of the chapters that you read that take place on Orus, on the planet. You see the discourse of the master. There's a master. They make a demand. If you don't comply with it, you got a problem. When you see the scenes on Analyst, you see the discourse of the university, I think, when you see about Shivik's struggles when he was teaching at a university on Analyst, right? He was, trying to say like, hey, I want to think about new things. I want to have ideas that are not the same old ideas. I kind of want to push the boundary out farther than it is right now. And the university discourse was like, dude, your job is not to be a revolutionary. Your job is to indoctrinate people into like a set of knowledge. That's what you're supposed to be doing. And so you saw that in the character of Sabul, who's controlling the presses and not letting Shivik publish things and send it out to different physicists and all that. You can totally see the university discourse there. The discourse of the hysteric, I think, is seen in Tien, I think was the character's name, the character who kind of goes crazy at one point. Mm-hmm. He writes a play and he tries to perform it. And no one thinks his play is any good. He's like kind of like making a demand of the master on Analyst, where he's saying like, hey, people of Analyst, guess what? You have a master. It's these norms. It's this big other that you think doesn't exist, but it does. And he was making a demand that way, and the way that he was dealt with was very harshly. What I think Shivik is trying to do, and you see it really clearly in my mind at the end of the novel, when he's saying like, I don't want you to do anything to get what I have to offer you. I'm just going to give it to you, and you're going to do whatever you do with it. It's not a product. It's not for sale. It doesn't come conditionally. There it is, right? And when people adopt that position of the analyst, what they're doing is they're operating in a non-transactional fashion. It isn't. All the other discourses, I think, are predicated on some kind of a this for that transactional mindset. The discourse of the analyst is the discourse that exists when you take the transaction out, and it's like, there it is. This comes up in psychoanalysis. Again, I'm kind of referencing my own psychoanalytic training here. Earlier, I mentioned how, to be an analyst, you have to go through psychoanalysis. And to a degree, that's true. And to a degree, it isn't, at least in the Lacanian world. In the Lacanian world, the only reason that you go through a psychoanalysis, the only reason that I guess like I went through a psychoanalysis, was to have a certain realization. And the realization is that there's no license to become a psychoanalyst. There's no license to become a Lacanian. There's no test you have to pass. There's no degree you have to get. Effectively, the only thing that's stopping you from calling yourself a Lacanian analyst and going out and doing analysis is you. You have to authorize yourself in order to do analysis. You can't get that authorization from somebody else. You can get recognition, sure, but you can't get authorization. And I think that's what Shivik is trying to say, is that all these other societies are predicated on power structures where one group of people has to authorize another in order to do X, Y, or Z thing. And what he's saying is the promise of Analyst is a society within which you can actually authorize yourself to do the work that you want to do. And that's what he had done. He had like actually tried to be that. He'd be, I will, and it's such an interesting narrative because you see what happens when somebody tries to adopt the position of the analyst in a society where most people are not adopting that particular discourse. And I think that's really cool. I don't know if that was kind of like too inside baseball, but that was one of the big points that I took out of this.
No, that was really interesting to me.
Yeah, no, that was fascinating. So, I mean, again, coming back to some questions about the way that we orient ourselves towards like leftist political positions or philosophies or whatever they might be. I mean, I guess what I'm kind of taking from this is on the surface, you can read this book as a sort of glorification of Analyst. But looking at it through these different discourses and Shivik's role as trying to step into this discourse of the analyst, it's almost as if it's trying to push us to say even Analyst itself has not actually achieved an escape or some sort of real transcendence or like moving through to some other type of society. And in some ways, the book is very open-ended in that way. It's that if you read this book and look at Analyst as sort of as the product, as the end result of Utopia, you've missed maybe the most radical reading of it.
For sure. One of the examples I can kind of give from the text itself that is Shivik really adopting this discourse of the analyst, when he leaves Analyst, he goes down to Oris. And so he's teaching at a university there as well. And so a bunch of students come to him and he says, okay, the way that my class is structured is nobody's going to get a grade. You're here to learn. So show up, listen, ask questions, read stuff, try to make me think about whatever you're thinking about. We'll just kind of go from there. And then people are like, wait, no, I actually want a grade. That's the other individuals, I think, trying to engage in the discourse of the master, and Shivik trying to cling to the discourse of the analyst. At a certain point, they're like, no, you need to give us grades. You need to give us an exam. And he's like, okay, I'll give you a final project. Write about something that you want to write about and turn it in. That's your final project. And I'll just give everybody an A. He's adopting that. He's like, I can't authorize you to write about something that you care about. Only you can authorize you to write about something that you care about. I can't authorize you to be a physicist. I can give you a grade. That's recognition, right? Like I can recognize you as somebody who has a degree, who I could say like, something about physics, but only you can authorize yourself to do physics. What he's doing there is the same kind of thing that happens in psychoanalysis when an individual authorizes themselves to practice psychoanalysis.
I was trying to find a quote, and I might just have to... Oh, yeah, here it is. So maybe as a way to encapsulate Shivik's position here is, I think, maybe the most famous quote from the book, and it's a quote near the end. He says, "You cannot buy the revolution. You cannot make the revolution. You can only be the revolution. It is in your spirit, or it is nowhere." I was kind of curious, for y'all thinking about that. Is Shivik in some way a kind of depiction of what true revolutionary subjectivity, at least for Le Guin, looks like? Because we're talking about it in this like very Lacanian sort of way of reading it, which I think is actually like incredibly helpful. But just to connect it up, it's almost as if the depiction of his subjectivity and how he navigates these different discourses in these two different societies is almost a way of trying to show like this is what revolutionary subjectivity actually could be. It's what it has the potential to be. I just see nods.
I'm waiting to see if Don wants to jump in there.
No. Cool.
Is that it?
Yeah,
you approve? Don, I always joke Don really is the big other of this show. He just silently sits here and just like nods like, yes, that is the statement. That is the line for Red Library now.
Don has authorized himself to be an analyst.
I have not. I'm the hysteric to Don's analyst.
So run that question by me one more time just to make sure, because I like it. I just want to make sure I actually answer the question you're asking.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if we take this Lacanian way of reading Shivik and the different depictions of societies as, maybe part of these different discourses, right? They function on these different discourses. I mean, is Shivik, his sort of stepping into the discourse of the analyst is also a stepping into this is what revolutionary subjectivity actually could look like. because we've talked about this on our show and with The Regrettable Century of, trying to recapture this sort of warm current in Marxism, trying to perform a salvage operation of sorts on these sort of lost strains in Marxism, precisely to try to re-engage with what does revolutionary subjectivity look like, not, for the sake of discarding a sort of materialist analysis and all this other bullshit that people think you're just interested in, like bourgeois sort of understandings of politics if you think that subjectivity is the only way to think about it. But to some degree, we are trying to actually reinsert revolutionary subjectivity back into the material critique, I think.
Yeah, so what I would say is that to be what I would call a dialectical pessimist or a revolutionary pessimist, or to be a revolutionary, one of the things that's going to be predicated on is castration. If you're not castrated, why on earth would you engage in revolution?
That's a damn good question, yeah.
And people who don't view themselves as castrated, the psychotics of the world, they're not really that interested in revolution. They just go and do what they want.
So would this be the Joker from the most recent iteration of the Joker? He is the psychotic. He's just basically like, I don't give a shit about the actual larger revolutionary social movement going on behind me. I'm just going to do whatever the hell I want and act on my desire.
I don't know, actually. I mean, like, I would love to kind of like dive into that, but then I would totally, I think, lose my train of thought in regards to the dispossessed. So I want to stick a pin in the Joker. That's a great question too.
Yeah, well, maybe we can talk about that or write some shit about it at some point. But yeah, I know, because I'm fascinated, because I think that the most engaging with the Joker and trying to really think through the depiction of the Joker and what it means in that film is just like a personal theoretical hobby of mine right now. But I do think it's useful. I do think it's really useful.
For sure. I want to circle back around to that. But I think that there's this idea that what Shivik does is revolutionary because, I think there's sort of like two ways that maybe we can try to respond to castration. I'm painting with an extremely broad brush here. So way number one is what I would call an optimistic way and an ultimately probably ineffective way. And it's to kind of construct a fantasy of non-castration. If we do this, if we follow this plan, if we adopt these policies, if we elect these leaders, some combination of those, then guess what? Castration won't be a problem anymore. And then people try to enact that, and inevitably, even if they're remarkably successful in their project, what they will discover is that castration will continue to exist, right? It won't go away. It'll still be there. We see that in Soviet Russia. We see that in this book on Analyst. They were still castrated. There was still a big other doing the castrating on Analyst through all these different social norms. You're not going to be able to get this thing that you think you want, this fantasy of non-castration. And if you did get it, you wouldn't want it anyway. That was the earlier point.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the revolutionary idea is not to rebel against castration. It's to recognize that castration is a thing that we are going to experience, and then to kind of perform a dialectical reversal within the concept of castration itself. And when you do that, the way that you experience your castration, where that others might experience their castration, can change. And castration can go from being something which is like driving you crazy, it's a torture, to being something that you think is kind of interesting. The ways in which you are kind of always trying to grapple with this phenomenon that is castration. And you can start to enjoy that, I think, to a degree, right? It's not just, and not to say that it'll like when you perform this dialectical reversal, you can kind of like bliss out and just like enjoy frustration and all that. I think people who take that reading too far actually foreclose on an adequate understanding of changing the actual material conditions within which people are contained, right? People have to have adequate material conditions, I think, in order to even engage in this project of changing their dialectical relationship to castration. But if you do have adequate material resources, as the people on Analyst did, then you're more likely anyways, to be able to kind of re-interpolate castration as a phenomenon, as a subjective experience. And when you do that, interesting things will happen. I don't know exactly what that means for every single person who goes through it, but I'm confident that if anybody does go through that, something really cool will happen.
In some way, isn't kind of the main issue with castration as we find it in Western capitalist, white supremacist, imperialist sort of cultures is that the way that you experience your castration is so thoroughly conditioned by material conditions, relationships of power, these historical sort of relations of capitalism and how it shapes us in certain ways, that you don't get any sort of leeway in how you experience that. You're going to be castrated and you're going to be shaped to respond to that in very, very particular ways based on these larger social, historical, material conditions.
Yeah, I think that's what's happening on Analyst is they've set up a society that definitely has flaws. But one of the things that it seems to be pretty good at is that people are really interested in meeting the material needs of others to the extent that they can. That last part, to the extent that they can, is really important. That's what they want to do. They want to do that because the idea is that if your material conditions are met, then what that does is it opens up the possibility to redirect energy, like cognitive energy, physical energy, all sorts of different energies that kind of reside in our bodies into all sorts of different pursuits, because you're not going to be stopping yourself from dying. Mm-hmm. And that is actually a really important thing. If your body is dying, my guess is that you're probably not going to be doing a lot of theoretical physics. You're not going to be doing a lot of Lacanian psychoanalysis, right? You're not going to be doing those sorts of things. Those are, anxiety, castration anxiety is a luxury when you think about it, right? It's a luxury of people who happen to have their material conditions met.
Yeah, castration anxiety is a first world problem.
Sure, yeah, I'll buy that, right?
I actually, my truly radical reading is that castration anxiety, to varying degrees, is a first, second, and third world problem. So,
yeah, maybe it's just to think that the castration anxiety that somebody who doesn't have their material needs met is like not castration anxiety; it's death anxiety, right? Mm-hmm. It's actually like annihilation anxiety, yeah. And that's going to trump everything. Once you don't have to have annihilation anxiety, like staring you in the face, then I think that opens up the door to experiencing castration anxiety, because even though you don't need to worry about like dying in the next day or two, now what are you going to worry about? You have this new vast tract of mental real estate upon which you can develop a huge skyscraper of anxiety. That skyscraper of anxiety is castration anxiety.
I actually want to reference a film that Comrade Commissar Don and I have talked about on a previous episode that I would not have thought about as science fiction. And I don't think that it is, but I think it does fit into this discussion about utopia and revolution and castration anxiety. I'm thinking about Goodbye Lenin, and the way that the main character, his whole experience of East Germany was this castration anxiety of thinking, oh, well, this society, I feel so everything is boring. Like I'm sort of barred from the enjoyment of Western Germany and the capitalist sort of consumerist culture. But as soon as the wall falls, he realizes how the castration anxiety was going to be just very different. And then he was going to sort of have this utopian yearning and trying to actually recreate that for his mother. So it's really interesting to me that there might be a similar sort of process going on, or is there a similar way to read Goodbye Lenin with Dispossessed that I think, again, is sort of illustrating the problems of the kind of subjective orientations we take towards revolutionary politics and what we think we're getting out of them and what we're actually getting out of them, which I think are two very different things.
Hell yeah. I think that in Goodbye Lenin, you actually see resistance to East Germany, I guess, maybe is what I'd say. Go from being a symptom to being a symptom, right? It goes through a significant shift as a result of this dialectical reversal that the protagonist experiences when he kind of like really goes deep into that. Like I'm going to go into my castration. I'm going to have to construct this world that I hate, in order to make sure that my mom doesn't go back into a coma or die. And in doing that, he was like, actually, maybe I don't hate this world as much as I thought I did.
Yeah.
That the way that he does that is that same thing can happen in relation to castration, I think.
Do you want to hit point 5? Have we already covered that?
No, we haven't. That's the last one here. So point 5 actually came from something when I was getting ready to sit down and talk to the two of you about this. I went to YouTube and I just did a search for Ursula K. Le Guin to see what came up. Because I'm like, I'll listen to some interviews or watch some interviews that she's done. Maybe there'll be something cool there. And I discovered an interview that she had done with The Nation. I don't remember how old this was. It's a short interview. It's not super long. I can send you a link to it for your show notes if you'd like.
Yeah, that'd be great.
In there, she says some stuff that I think it just struck me as like, you know what, that's actually really cool. It's really interesting. And I think it would be worthwhile to bring up and talk about it. So the first thing she said is the interview is asking her about writing science fiction and writing about the future. And she said that she, like with a novel like The Dispossessed in particular, I think she says that she never thought of it as writing about the future. That's not what she was doing. She said in science fiction, whenever any writer is engaging in writing about the future, they're not actually writing about the future. It's just a way of saying things about your present that you can't say when you're writing about your present.
What does progress mean to you after having spent so long thinking about the future?
It's not. I never did think much about the future. I'm only interested really in the present and the past. Who knows what the future is? Milan Kundera says, who knows? It's not there. We don't know what it is. The future in science fiction is just a metaphor for now.
But that's really what it is. It's always writing about your present, just kind of dressing it up as the future as you do it. And I thought that was a really interesting thing. And after I heard that, I kind of paused the interview that I was watching and I got to thinking about it. And I was like, I'm seeing just how kind of like crazily libidinally invested people are now in ideologies of different sorts. I mean, they're people are really willing to throw down in super oftentimes violent ways for ideas right now. And to do so in a way which I would say is often uncritical, ultimately, right? And it's like, if you're going to pick up a rock and throw it, I really do think it's probably good to, and before you do that or as you're doing that, both probably, to ask yourself, like, am I sure I'm right before I do this violent act, right? And you might, if you might actually decide, yes, I am right. I'm throwing this rock. That can totally happen. But I think what happens instead is that people get so into whatever they believe and they get so caught up in the libidinal energy that when they pick up the rock, they just want to throw it. That's what they want to do. They don't want to think about throwing it. They want to throw it. I've got a rock in my hand. It's time to throw a rock. This is going to be great. And what Shivik is doing in The Dispossessed is he is stopping. And he's like, wait a minute. Do I actually want to do that? Like, do I want to continue to live the way that we've lived? Do I want to follow the norms kind of unquestioningly and uncritically? Or do I want to engage with them in a different kind of a way? And that's something that I think is really, really necessary now in all politics, right? Like, I think that would be really great if people from different ideological positions adopted a more Shivekian kind of position where they were willing to kind of go like, I should probably figure out some things before I make some decisions. And to do that, to ask those questions, to try to figure stuff out, it doesn't show like a lack of commitment. In fact, it shows just the opposite. I think it shows a huge commitment to revolutionary ideas. And just, kind of like labeling people as who disagree with you as counter-revolutionary or something like that, that's not revolutionary at all, right? That's a total negation. That's like somebody saying they're a revolutionary when they call somebody else a counter-revolutionary. They're being the biggest counter-revolutionary that there is.
I've never seen that happen before in my life, ever.
Me too. I was just talking about that, hypothetically or something.
Yeah, I mean, hypothetically, that only happens, in some weird abstracted realm away from real political involvement, especially on the left.
Right, and Hollywood movies that are made by Marvel, right?
Yes, of course, yes. This actually reminds me of something that Alex said at the end of our Philosophy for Militants episode, where he was talking about the cover of the book is a very large red gun that also looks like a book. And this is also a very Žižekian point. But also, I think this is going to relate to something that, just to give him another shout out, that Ryan and McGowan on Why Theory have talked about, which I think is really important about ideological critique. And it's basically that any ideological critique that you also don't implicate yourself in is in itself not really a critique. That if you're going to talk about ideological functioning in like this group or that group, you also have to include yourself in it if you really want to take it as far as it needs to go to really be critical. And I think that's really crucial, that whenever we're sort of critiquing, and I've talked about this on the show, I know you've talked about this as well, if you come from a background that isn't already, some firebrand revolutionary Marxist who lives out in the jungle and, like fights the state, whatever that is, odds are you might come from, let's say for me, like a very right-wing background. And I think whenever I look back on it now, I can remember thinking that way and the sort of self-evident truth of those ideas. And to me, that's why being on the left now, every time I think about a critique, I mean, I don't always live up to this. Hell, I maybe don't even often live up to it. But the idea is that if I'm going to present a critical perspective on a position or an ideology, if I'm not willing to include myself in that position, then I should probably shut my fucking mouth. And that's something that I think is really important. And it's helped check certain impulses that I might have to find myself moving very unconsciously over to that counter-revolutionary side, where it's like, yeah, just pick up the rock and throw it and don't think. And it's been helpful for me is to always sort of implicate myself in the ideological functioning itself and being able to step back and actually try to do that. I think it's incredibly hard. It takes a lot of time and energy. And we've talked about this, the idea that your fantasy of whatever it is to be a revolutionary subject, which prevents you from feeling that castration anxiety, the idea that you would have to give that up and you would have to potentially let go of that or to accept the fact that you are castrated. And even if I throw this rock, it isn't going to take that away. And yet I'm still going to throw the damn rock. I mean, I think that's something I've tried to strive for as a way to wrestle with these kind of problems. So I don't know. I mean, I guess for me, it's a way of thinking about whenever I do engage with people of like different ideological positions than my own, hopefully to me, I think the thing that seems to allow any sort of real dialogue to happen has usually been whenever I'm like trying to implicate myself in my own critiques as well. And not to back down, whenever someone like offers a very legitimate critique of your position and to just actually say, yeah, you're right, that is a very legitimate critique of my position. I maybe don't even have a good answer for that, but I'm still going to engage you in the topic because I've already included myself in the critique. Anyway, I don't know if that makes sense, but it's a way I think I've tried to really shape how I engage with these sorts of questions.
As I think of like Shevik as a revolutionary type, I think that there is a difficulty for me in trying to imagine all revolutionary subjects as being similar to him, only because obviously, like, I'd read this, so I don't know how true it is, but I think Le Guin actually said that she had modeled, I guess she had known and met Robert Oppenheimer when she was younger, he was, Shevik was actually modeled after, like, the personality of Oppenheimer, which I think is, like, real interesting. I'm not sure what to do with that.
Yeah.
But he's very clearly like a brilliant scientist who's also able to enact like a very significant influence over the worlds that he lives in. Like, do we imagine typical or like normal revolutionary subjects as having that same both like mental capacity and the same ability to have that, both like actual influence on the world around him, but also just like that ability to actually be very critical and imagine a new future? I
think what Shevik is doing again is he's able to, since he lives in a society that means he doesn't have to worry about where his next meal, I mean, like when he has to worry about where his next meal is going to come from, it's not just him, it's everybody. Everybody's collectively worrying about that. It's a society where like if he goes someplace, he will have a roof over his head. He'll be able to go and get something to eat. His basic needs will be seen to the extent that they can be seen to. And what that allows for, I think, is for him to develop this capacity to think about really everything, that he comes into contact with, and to be really kind of like indecisive, actually, for quite some time. That's one of the interesting things about the character, right? In a lot of ways, he's got a lot of merits, but one of his flaws, I would say, is that he is an indecisive character. But his indecisiveness is not like due to a lack of care or a lack of intellect or anything else like that. It's actually an abundance of care. It's an abundance of intellect. And so what he does is he takes his time to really, I think, deliberate. And when he decides he's going to throw the rock, he's really thought about it, right? And when he decides not to throw the rock, he's really thought about it. But usually, probably the problem with acting in that way is that by the time you've made your decision, it doesn't really matter whether you throw the rock or not, right? The moment has passed you by. And that's one of the tough things, I think, about his character that I notice, right, is that he's always trying to do the right thing. But because he's trying to do the right thing, I think a lot of times the moment goes by too fast, and then he ends up having to just do the next thing because that's what's in front of him now.
I mean, one other thing I would kind of offer if Le Guin did base Shevik on Oppenheimer, and maybe this comes back to some of Jameson's critiques about Le Guin, maybe letting her sort of liberal perspective on this shine through. I mean, do you all think the fact that the primary, potentially revolutionary subject in the novel, the fact that it's depicted as this, character very directly modeled on Oppenheimer, this figure of science, of rationality, and the fact that the character is singled out very clearly, this sort of atomized individual, even in the midst of this sort of, quote unquote, utopian anarcho-communist society, to me, I almost wonder if that in itself is sort of a kind of liberal way of framing the whole narrative of revolutionary subjectivity, it's this lone figure of science. And, again, this is written in 1974, right at the sort of real revving up of neoliberal policies, and not to say that like Le Guin is on board with like neoliberal sorts of perspectives on society and policy and economics and such, but to me, just to think about it in a very critical Marxist way, wondering if that in itself is also kind of a depiction of a particular worldview, mainly a liberal one, to show the main character as this figure, this like rational figure of science.
There is remind me if it's actually in the Jameson essay or not, or if I'm thinking of something else. But Jameson does see Shevek and some of other Le Guin's characters as being, in a sense, or maybe representative as being like quite passive, right? It's just like sort of going along with the flow. And I watched a different interview with her, and she actually specifically talked about how she actually did like, and she thought that it was very positive to have this sort of like Taoist notion of, in a sense, like not struggling against like the current too much to some degree. And I think especially I think it's a lot more present in maybe the Lathe of Heaven than in this work necessarily, but I think Jameson definitely seems to critique that a little bit, which, I don't think Jameson would necessarily be the type of person that would say like, no, you shouldn't think, you should just throw the rock and stuff. But there does seem to be like, at least a little bit, he does want to like maybe push that line a little bit more than Le Guin seems to do.
I think that maybe what Shivik makes me realize as we're having this conversation is it's what would Robert Oppenheimer have been like if he would have grown up in a society like Anaris. And what Oppenheimer is what happens to somebody like that when there is no Anaris, right? When there is no alternative other than to kind of like live your life on Oris, where their capitalism exists in the way that it does. There are nation states that exist in the way that they do. That's what would happen, ultimately. So in that sense, I think that, that's utopia is the process. If you create the process, if you enact the process to the extent that you can and you care for it in the way that you can, what you might be able to do is to create the material and social conditions within which somebody who has a remarkable intellect might be able to do something astonishing. Right. But what we have in our society is not that, right? We don't have anything that I can tell that's like that now, where somebody who had that caliber of intelligence and intellect and wisdom and whatnot would be able to mobilize it towards like an emancipatory project. And I mean, you see that, like, look what Shivik does with his formula at the end. He gives it away through like a kind of like deus machina, right? The Hainish. He's like, I'll just have the Hainish give the secret to everybody, and then no one can own it, right? Because I'll have like put it out there, and now everybody has it. So no one gets to own the information. Oppenheimer didn't have the Hainish, right? He couldn't have taken his discoveries and just like given them to people. I wonder what would have happened if he could.
He had the U.S. military-industrial complex and the Rand Corporation, who he gave all his shit to.
I like the reading a lot, of thinking of this as like what would it look like for to have an Oppenheimer in a different setting. I like that reading a lot.
I know we might be kind of coming to the end here, but I actually have maybe, a critical question or just something that really stuck out to me reading it this time around. And it basically is how, it's not called this, but basically how the stand-in for the Soviet Union exists in the novel, and the way that, socialism is depicted as brutal authoritarian thing where the state controls everything. And I was reading it this time, and I just couldn't help but wonder of how much Le Guin was also depicting this stark divide between capitalism here and socialism with its big other of the state over here, as also very much playing out the sort of the standard ideological functioning of anti-communism and anti-socialism that existed in the US at the time. And, just to be clear, no one's saying that there wasn't bad shit that happened and there aren't things to critique, but the way that those two societies are depicted in such this stark, like, world reductive way, I couldn't help but think about that in a really critical way and saying, like, wow, yeah, the way this sort of exists. I know Shevik has a friend who was from, I can't even remember what the society was called, the sort of like stand-in. But, I know he has that friend and there's some interactions that he has, but I just couldn't help but wonder if like that in itself was, again, kind of a legacy of this like Cold War like background that was happening in which she was writing the novel, especially in response to the Vietnam War and, the role of third worldist guerrilla movements and challenging U.S. imperialism. I don't know. It was interesting to me of like what wasn't in the book. I guess that's kind of what I was most intrigued by.
Oh, for sure. I mean, like she totally sets up like these sort of like archetypal states that I would really love to see. What Amazon has done with The Handmaid's Tale over the past 3 seasons is they've taken like a world that was kind of like roughly sketched out in a book, and they've built it, right? And then they've expanded it beyond what was in the text, and they've done it in ways that I found like really, really interesting and really productive for my own thinking. I would love to see them do something like that with The Dispossessed, because Le Guin, I think, sketches out, it's the blueprint, right? It's the rough, here's kind of how this looks. And it would be really interesting to see somebody take that blueprint and kind of build it.
I mean, they've done it with Man in the High Castle too. Like, why not do it with the Dispossessed? Yeah.
That would be awesome. I think that Amazon should be writing you a check right now. That's what I think.
Bezos, give me those Bezos bucks right now. Sign up on our Patreon, Bezos.
You know what I think? I just had this idea, right? That we should make a new currency. It should be called like revolutionary dollars. And it would be dollars that you have liberated from Jeff Bezos.
You know what? That is a good a way to start a whole new monetary system as any that I can think of.
You can spend them anywhere but Amazon.
You spend it anywhere but Amazon.
Can we like make a cryptocurrency that somehow does this? Is there a way to do that? I don't know anything about cryptocurrency.
I mean, I don't either. Are they still a thing? I thought all of them collapsed at this point.
No, they're still a thing. Yeah.
Is Dogecoin still a thing?
Oh,
that
yeah,
was my favorite
I think that's
one.
still one of the most successful ones. Yeah.
That is unbelievable. God, what strange times we live in.
I mean, think about like the Dogecoin or Dogecoin.
I've heard it's Doge.
Doge, okay.
Doge, yeah.
Dogecoin is like, I mean, that's what's hilarious about cryptocurrencies. That one is actually significantly more successful than the vast majority of them.
Oh, the real strikes again. Yeah.
That's great.
Comrade Neil, I mean, I don't know. Do you have any last things that we haven't touched on that you want to wrap up with? Where do you want to take us to maybe close this thing out?
Okay, so you might actually end up not including this. I don't know, but as we were talking, I had something kind of jump into my mind, and it doesn't have anything to do with the Dispossessed, but it has a lot to do with castration. And what I think, I'm going to try to tie it to the Dispossessed. We'll see how successful this is. I think what Shivik does in the Dispossessed is he recognizes that he is a castrated subject, right? That's what's going on through the novel. That's the kind of the arc, is he's like, I am a castrated subject. That is part of what I am. And in recognizing it, what he does is he's not struggling against the castration in the same way. The best example I have ever seen in my entire life of a real person actually doing this thing in real time in front of me, like actually having like what seemed to be like an epiphany, or maybe he didn't have the epiphany in front of me, but he enacted the epiphany in front of me in regards to castration. So I worked at this, it was a group home, I guess, right? So there's teenage kids and they don't have, it's basically, you can go to this group home or you can go to jail, and the group home is actually nicer than jail. So they tend to go to the group home. And one of the things that we did in this group home is, different groups and stuff, right? Like you had to give chemical dependency education and healthy relationships and all these things. And one of the groups we had to do was this thing called slip group. And slip group was this process where, like, if Adam had done something and it had bothered me, I could write it down on a slip of paper and put that piece of paper in a box. And then later on, somebody would take all the pieces of paper out of a box and the whole community would come together. Then I'd have to like sit down and face you in a chair, and you'd have to sit down, and we'd both sit on our hands. And I would say something like, Adam, when you called me a counter-revolutionary fucktard, that hurt my feelings. And I don't really think that was fair, because like you don't even know my politics, because we haven't had that kind of conversation. And so, I just need you to, if you're going to call me a counter-revolutionary fucktard, you should at least do me the courtesy of like knowing my politics first. So if you want to have that conversation, we can do that. All right. And then we'd have to like shake hands.
This is definitely going in the episode, by the way.
Oh yeah, we're definitely including this. This is solid gold.
Yeah, this performative friendship thing, right?
Yeah.
So I'm doing this group. It's usually terribly like unexciting. All right. And there's a kid, and he would put a piece of paper in the box, and he sat with this other kid, and he's like, so here's the deal, dude. The other day, you told me that my mother is a crackhead and she sucks dick for money, and like that I don't know who my dad is. And you're right. My mama uses crack. She probably sucks dick to get money to use crack. I don't know who my dad is. That's my fucking life, man. So like knowing that makes you think you're better than me, makes you think you're cool or something like that. Like that's fine. I just want everybody to know that's my life. You're right. And like everybody is totally quiet, because what are you going to say to that, right?
Yeah.
Here's a kid basically trying to insult another kid to like just embarrass him and make him feel small and insignificant and stupid by saying these things. And I'm sure that when the kid did that kind of insulting, he was assuming that the other kid was going to like try to fight him or something. Mm-hmm. And he just basically was like, all those terrible things that you just said about me in my life are completely accurate. So there you go, man. And that's like saying I am castrated. And in saying I am castrated, you actually change the way that castration functions.
Have y'all ever seen 8 Mile, the Eminem movie?
I have.
So that is exactly what Eminem does at the end to win the final rap battle. Is he just sort of accepts like the sort of shit talking of the other rapper. He just basically is like, yeah, Yeah, I'm just like a piece of shit, like white trash dude who also raps. And it's really interesting. Like, I remember watching that in the theater, and I don't even give a shit about Eminem. You hear that, Eminem? I don't give a shit about you. But that was a great scene because he did that exact same thing, as he just sort of accepted that sort of attempt to like exert that power and dominance over him. Just like, yeah, that's my life, man. And then he basically just like destroyed the other rapper with his rap, basically accepting all the things that he said about him.
This guy ain't no motherfucking MC. I know everything he's got to say against me. I am white. I am a fucking punk. I do live in a trailer with my mom. My boy Future is an Uncle Tom. I do got a dumb friend named Cheddar Bob who shoots himself in his leg with his own gun. I did get jumped by all 6 of you chumps. And Wink did fuck my girl. I'm still standing here screaming fuck the free world. So never try to judge me, dude. You don't know what the fuck I've been.
I never really thought I'd see the day where you actually said something nice about Eminem.
Listen, I think deep down, Eminem and 8 Mile is actually a very revolutionary film.
I can't even tell if you're joking.
I just think you idealize Eminem.
I probably do, actually. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm also in therapy right now, so I'll talk about that later. I'm going to walk in and be like, all right, hey, listen, so I know we've been talking about like depression and my deep dialectically pessimist sort of worldview, and I think the world is about to end. But listen, I've realized that I have a deeply sort of utopian take on Eminem, and I'm really disturbed by it. I need to talk about it right now.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. Eminem is kind of an interesting figure, right? He's this weird dude who I think his success reminds other people that they are castrated. And I think that some people have like a really negative reaction to that, which is really just their castration anxiety kind of being enacted in a particular way.
I think I did listen to his last album, and it's basically him just responding to all the people who talked shit about him. So yeah, I think actually that's actually a pretty good take on Eminem, actually.
I don't think I've ever listened to an Eminem album.
I mean, I'm not actually recommending it, just so you know. I'm not. Red Library is not pro Eminem in any sort of way. I'm just saying that I think 8 Mile could be a revolutionary film if you look at it through a Lacanian lens.
Well, I think that after people listen to this podcast, we're going to see him jump to the top of the charts again.
He's coming back up. I had one final thought. And Neil, remind me, was there a Lacanian sort of word for the idea of like whenever you're castrated, you're basically just sort of trying to make other people experience more castration? Was there?
I was calling that male, the male subjective reaction or male sexuation.
Yes, thank you. So this male subjective reaction, in the interest of giving some kind of dystopian example of sort of the counter to everything that we're talking about, and very much this sort of male subjective reaction to this, I was telling Don this the other day. I've been watching Succession, which I think is maybe like the most intense dystopian depiction of that I've ever seen in my life. And if you haven't watched it, it's brilliant just to watch. Yeah, I mean, I was curious if you had seen it, because to me, that's like basically the engine of that whole show.
You know what? You saying that, as I was reading this, one of the other things I was doing is I was watching the show Years and Years. Have either of you seen this?
I have seen it, yeah.
I've been wanting to watch it. I haven't seen it yet, though.
It's crazy, because Years and Years is actually the most effective form of horror that I have ever been subjected to. It is I would call it the best horror show ever. There are no monsters. There are no aliens. There are no poltergeists or anything else like that, right? It's just the way that things are kind of turned up gradually over a series of episodes in a really effective way is like I was going to bed shaken, for real. Like, I mean, not like super shaken that I couldn't sleep, but like it took me a while to calm down after I would watch those episodes. Like I had to be like, oh man, now I'm all sorts of like anxious and fired up at the same time. And so yeah, I needed to just like listen to music that was not anything like that, and maybe then try to fall asleep.
To me, Years and Years is Black Mirror if it was good.
Dude, it's wild.
Yeah, I mean, there's some pretty fascinating things in there.
I'll definitely watch it then.
Yeah.
I haven't finished it yet. I'm very close to the end right now, because I have 2 jobs and I have a almost 8-month-old child, so I get to watch like an hour of TV like a week.
Okay, so
and you're doing 2-hour podcasts.
Yeah, and you're doing a 2-hour podcast with us assholes.
After the child is in bed.
I know. I do have something. I'm going to ask you for a favor, okay, Comrade Neil? So whenever you finish the series, I want to hear some general thoughts you have about it, especially in the context of our whole discussion tonight on this episode. I really am curious what you're going to think about the ending.
That would be cool. I will totally do that.
Well, do we have final thoughts? Comrade Don, big other of the library, do you have any thoughts?
No.
Did we integrate the Jameson enough into this? I wasn't sure how much we wanted to
talk about it
it
a lot, but I think
he was there as a spectral presence in the background, I think.
Sure.
Yeah, kind of. He was lurking, sort of.
Yeah, I mean, he's a bit of a lurker, that's for sure. You know, it does make me think, if we do a follow-up on this, and I do have this idea to propose. I've been thinking about the episodes we did for From78, Neil, and I was thinking about this, and I just realized that we might want to have an ongoing series that we call, like, the Lost Futures series, of, like, engaging with utopian imaginings of this sort. And Comrade Commissar Don, you and I have been talking about reading An American Utopia by Jameson at some point, and that would be kind of an ideal thing to read after this, I think.
Yeah.
So maybe we could do an episode on that at some point.
I'd be down.
I don't know if I could do that. I'd have to have the time to read it, but I would love to do that with you, because the idea of like reading Frederick Jameson that's the kind of stuff that I do when I should be doing other things like grading exams, things like that. Like, I can't.
Aren't your students going to listen to this?
Probably, actually, yeah. But I get it done. The exams get graded.
Well, yeah, then that's all good.
Yeah. So final thoughts. I'll get a couple final thoughts that I was going to say here. First is that the big thing I take from this is that even in the anarcho-communist utopia as a process, there is still always going to be castration, that there is no way around that. I think that's probably one of the biggest takeaways that I have from this particular text, and it's a good one, I think.
I would agree with that too.
I was going to say is that people read this and you're thinking like, okay, I finished this book. What's something I could read next that would be kind of fun? I want to suggest something that is very different from The Dispossessed, but also I think kind of gets at some of the same themes in a really interesting way. The name of the book is Infinite Detail by Tin, I don't know how you'd say his last name, Maughan. How would you say that? Maughan?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah.
Infinite Detail. It's a short one. It's really, really an interesting book, and it's where The Dispossessed makes certain themes kind of come out in a utopian setting. Infinite Detail makes them come out in a dystopian setting, and I think it's actually a really interesting book.
Yeah, I'm gonna put that on my list to read for sure.
Cool.
I think on that note, the time is nigh. The hour is late. I don't know. I'm just trying to be dramatic. I don't know. I'm trying to make it sound like we're like a legit operation over here.
Comrade,
definitely not. Yeah.
Wherever you go, whatever you do next, make glorious mistakes.
There you go.
Bam, done.
End it.
We out.
Yep.
Red Library out. We'll see you next time, comrades. Peace. Welcome to the future. I don't know what that means. I just wanted to say something really dramatic. And in the spirit of our episode that we did with Comrade Neil. Big shout out to him for coming on the show, for taking his time, being very generous in his thoughts, his efforts, his reading, his writing. And we are most honored to have him in the library for this episode, and I'm sure for future ones too, to bring his perspective, his expertise on teaching Lacan, making it as accessible as I've almost ever heard it anywhere. So we hope you really got a lot out of that, considering how much we talk about psychoanalysis. So I think he did a great service to us, to hopefully you out there, comrade listeners, and the leftosphere in general. Coming up next week, Comrade Commissar Don and I are going to be picking up our Revolutionary Politics in Central and South America series with a more historically inclined episode focusing on some of the guerrilla movements throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s in some Central American countries such as Nicaragua and El Salvador. So we think that's also going to be a great follow-up to this one, which is a little bit more creative, a little bit more imaginative on the literary side, a little bit more theory heavy, but we're going to shift gears and bring you something very concrete, very material next week as a good balance for a balanced breakfast, let's say. All right, remember, keep supporting the show. Head over to Patreon, follow us on Twitter, Facebook, hit us up with those stars, those reviews on iTunes, keep supporting the show. And until next time, keep dreaming, keep searching for those utopian imaginings, recast the present in light of the future, keep digging up those lost futures from the past, stay strong, keep fighting, keep writing, keep thinking, keep finding the others, and we'll see you back here next time. Red Library out. Peace.